Why don't you take a seat and tell me what's going on? I thought we would continue our Consult the Doctor series. So the first question, I've selected 4 that I think are all really interesting. And also, again, some questions that I get a lot. So it's fun to try and answer them here, hopefully once and for all. First question comes from Harim53mm on Instagram, who says, is it normal that finer nibs feel scratchy? I have 2 pilot Kakunos, one in medium and one in fine. The medium one feels smooth as butter when I'm writing, but the one with fine nib feels scratchy. I already checked the tines and they're perfectly aligned. The short answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is yes, and it kind of makes sense when we really reason through what's going on here. So, what's a fountain pen nib? Let's get really existential about this. Well, something that allows you to commit your most intimate thoughts to paper, but in a slightly less existential manner. It's a piece of metal, and that metal is typically a gold alloy or some sort of steel alloy, and that's it. Now, the problem with gold is that gold is very soft, and that means that if gold would actually touch the paper, it would wear out relatively quickly with all the writing that you do. So the solution that was come up with quite a long time ago is to weld balls of tipping to the end of the nib. Now, they used to use iridium. I don't believe they do anymore. People still say that, and people still stamp nibs with iridium point Germany, for example, but I think the actual use of iridium was seized quite a while ago. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What matters is the balls of tipping are made of a very hard metal, so that it can withstand a lot of abrasion. Because think about it, that's what you're doing. You're rubbing a piece of metal up against paper again and again and again and again and again. At some point it's going to wear out. So the harder that is, right, the slower it'll wear out. And I suppose to a degree, the easier it is for you to shape it. I'm kind of thinking up this on the fly. I suppose easiest to shape it because it will retain its shape longer. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, the broader the nib is, the more tipping material there is. And tipping material has a specific shape. Now, if we're not talking about specialty nibs like crisp italics, for example, which have very sharp corners in their tipping, so you get a lot of line variation, but the corners are so sharp they could cut into the paper, right? But we're not talking about that kind of scratchiness. That's a specialty nib that requires a special, sometimes angle, special way to use it, special alignment to the paper. You're talking about round nibs, medium nibs, fine nibs, broad nibs, etc. Now, when you think about it, the more tipping material there is, the more material there is to polish, and that's what they do with a fountain pen nib, because the more polished it is, the smoother it will write. And unfortunately, that's a bit of an inverted U shape, because if you polish it enough, it's going to be very smooth. But if you polish it too much, the nib is going to skip. Because then you get a problem called baby's bottoms, which means that kind of the inside of the the inside of the tipping is kind of polished as well. And then you get, well, they call it baby's bottoms for a reason. You don't need much imagination for that. And then there's no good contact between the nib and the paper in a nutshell. And then you get skipping behavior. But that's also not your question. Your simple question was, are fine nibs scratchier? And the short answer typically is yes. Think about why. The broader the nib, the more material is there to polish, and the smoother the writing experience will be. One of the reasons I like broad nibs. Now, that is not to say that finer nibs cannot be made to write smoothly. You can always send the pen to a nibmeister. They will smooth it out, and it will be as smooth as they can make it. But yes, typically there is more feedback. Then also don't forget that the pilots you're using are Japanese nibs, which typically have a nib grade that is 1 grade finer than the European counterpart. So for example, a medium Japanese nib often writes like a fine European nib, and the fine Japanese nib you're using actually writes like typically a European extra fine nib. Extra fine is even less tipping material than fine, right? There's even less to polish, and yes, therefore, as a result, it's going to have a bit more feedback as you write with it. Now, then there are untipped nibs, which you sometimes see in modern italic nibs, especially steel italic nibs, but also in certain dip nibs. Most dip nibs are untipped, and they also have quite a lot of feedback often. But that's why. So it's a very sensible question with, I think, a very sensible and in principle logical answer. So the solution is to either buy a broader nib, but that may not work with your handwriting, or get it smooth. You smooth it yourself with micro mesh, or ask someone who's done it before how they do it, or have someone else do it. And people can typically smooth it a bit, but there's only so much tipping to work with, right? So you can't always make a fine nib buttery smooth. It's not always possible. Okay, the next question, I'm just writing down the timestamp. The next question we have also came from Instagram and was, I thought that was another very good one, from Paul Thos. Dear Doctor, I've never understood the whole wet versus dry ink business. What makes a wet ink wet and a dry ink dry? Well, ink is a liquid, so it's always wet. Ha! But I fully understand what you mean. Now, I'm not sure if your question is, I don't understand how to classify whether an ink is wet or dry, or whether the question is what actually physically makes the ink wet or dry. So let me first address the psychological issue of wet versus dry. Some inks flow like a fountain, and I'll come back to fountains in just a second. Right? They are very wet. Some inks are even lubricated, making them a very, very smooth writing liquid. That's a very smooth writing experience. Other inks are much drier. Many, not all, many Lamy inks, for example, are considered to be a bit drier. That means they flow less richly. You don't get as much of the ink on the paper, and as a result, that ink can be a little drier. By the way, this also ties into the previous question of nib scratchiness. Sometimes using a wetter ink can give the impression that your pen writes a bit more smoothly. So Harim, you can also try that. I'm thinking, for example, of Iroshizuku inks, which are expensive, but they're also lubricated, and they are very nicely flowing inks. And there are others. Noodlers also makes lubricated inks, etc. An ink doesn't have to be lubricated to be wet. Some inks just feel really wet. I feel, for example, that Mont Blanc Irish Green is a very wet ink, whereas Mont Blanc Toffee Brown is drier. It flows less richly. It's still a very nice ink in my mind. Not as nice as B.R.E. Brown, obviously, but, it's still not bad. So I think that's the first part of the answer to your question. Wet versus dry. How much of it flows out the nib, right? Now, the second part of the question I find harder to answer. What exactly makes the ink drier or wetter? Well, what I can say is this. Think about what an ink is, chemically speaking. It only has a couple of components in it. There's water, obviously, because it's a liquid. There is some sort of dye, which gives it its color, so suspension of dyes, I think. And then there is typically some sort of antifungal agent, because you keep dipping a nib into a bottle of ink. So you're kind of sort of contaminating that, right? So you don't want anything bad to grow in it, which, sorry, I touched my microphone, I'm sorry. That sometimes happens anyway. I've had that with some J. Herbin inks, for example, that actually developed a stringy goo. So I lifted the pen up, that is the pen uncapped up out of the bottle of ink, and a string of goo was hanging from the nib. That can happen, and then you throw out the ink because you don't want that in your pen. So typically some sort of fungicide or that kind of stuff. And then the final thing, which we also should not forget, is a binding agent. Because do the experiment, put some dye in water, put it on a page of like a sheet of paper, the water is going to evaporate, dry up, and then the dye is powdery and it just, you can blow it off the page. So you also need something to affix your ink on the page. At least that's how I understand the composition of inks. Now, I suppose that the sort of fungicide agent and the binding agent, maybe they, especially the binding agent, I could see, but I'm not chemistry is not my profession, but I could see how maybe that would influence ink, making it a bit drier. But I think the other important component, probably more important than the binding agent, which could be complete fabrication of my mind, but more important than that is the dye. It turns out, and I think, at least that's my experience, that certain ink colors, like color groups, are drier than others. I have seen many pretty wet greens. I've also seen some drier ones. But specific dyes, I suppose, can make an ink drier. It's just the chemical property of those dyes that they flow a little less well. Why? I don't know. Resistance? I'm not saying they clog the feed, but they just don't flow as nicely. I don't know. I'm kind of hypothesizing on this, but I've always felt that that's the issue, and that certain dyes can just make an ink a bit wetter, some make them a bit drier, and if nothing like a lubricant is added, then you can notice that effect. That's pretty much all I had to say about that. I hope that's an answer to your question. It's kind of me making things up as I go, but that's kind of what I do. So, moving on. I had this question that I also found very interesting. I'm just writing down the timestamp, forgive me. Which was from Welcome to the World with Sean, who says, where can one buy good and affordable double broad or triple broad pens other than Kaweco? Well, I'm dying, sorry. Well, it ain't that easy. There was a time when Pelikan had double broads and triple broads and even oblique double broads and triple broads in their regular lineup, and you might have to go to a pen store that could order them for you, but Pelikan made them all the time. It was not a big problem to get them. You might have to wait a couple days for them to come in, but that was all. Montblanc also had obliques and triple broads, at least oblique triple broads and double broads. And unfortunately, especially the obliques are specialty nibs, but many, I think, pen companies consider the very broad nibs, double and triple broads, to be specialty nibs. And think about the normal distribution, and then think about how you have a mean. And the mean in nib grades is a medium nib. And I think a lot of people go for medium nibs, and a lot of people also go, I don't know which group is represented more. If it would be a normal distribution, I suppose the fine nibs would be a little less popular, but I always see a lot of people using fine nibs. So I think it's also a matter of demand, right? This is a very obvious thing to say, but if most people go for medium and fine nibs, why would you offer double broad and triple broad nibs if let's say 1 in 10 people actually buys them? I'm making up this number on the spot because I'm not a pen manufacturer, but I can see that would come into the equation, quite obviously so. But that was not your question. Your question was, where can I get them? Well, it's not easy, because I think a lot of companies don't make them. I know that B.R.E makes a double broad, which in my mind, I've had 2 of those. One was indeed quite broad. One kind of wrote. That was a number 8 nib. And one of them kind of wrote like a regular broad. That was a number 6 nib. So if you have a Pelikan or a Montblanc, you can try the aftermarket. Remember that the M400 nibs, which were gold, also fit in the M200 series of pens, and I want to say on the M600 series as well, but I could be wrong there, but I thought they did. They were made in double broad and triple broad, and in the aftermarket, for example, eBay, you can sometimes find them still, although they are becoming rarer and rarer because people are buying them up, right? Anyway, that's what I would say, because a lot of companies, it's just not an option. I don't believe Parker currently has a double broad. I don't think Waterman has a double broad. Maybe they do, but I don't remember seeing them. So in other words, good luck. Because I don't know. The other option that you might consider if you really want to get a very broad nib, but you just can't find it, is to go to a nib retipper. I think, for example, of Greg Manuskin in California, you can send almost any nib to him. He'll take off the old tipping and he'll weld on new tipping pretty much as broad as would fit. Obviously, within reason, you cannot have tipping this wide on a fountain pen, but you understand what I mean. And I had a Parker 51 of his that he got the old tipping off and he turned it into, I think, a 1.3 millimeter. I think it was a 1.3 millimeter italic. No, it was probably a stub. Anyway, it was very smooth and it was very broad, way broader than any other stock Parker 51. So if you're willing to spend a bit of money, if you have a pen that you really like, but you just wish that that extra fine was actually triple broad, then that could be an option too. Just make sure you discuss it with him. Okay, what else? I have one more question. And this one I thought was actually quite fun because it's a little different. This question came from Jeff on Instagram, and Jeff asks, why are they called fountain pens? And I think that is a very good question. So I this was something I had in my mind to look up for a while. So this was just the final push I needed. Apparently the term fountain pen we can find in English since about 1823. You always have to Waterman's patent and all that. But anyway, let's not attach too much value to that date. It sounds like it could be about right. In any case, fountain, right? So came into English the word fountain from Old French fontaine, which itself came from Latin fontana. And basically a fountain is a thing that squirts water, right? So you have some sort of reservoir that, like, water gets pushed out. And a fountain pen has a reservoir of ink, whether it's a piston filler, a cartridge converter, vacuum, it doesn't matter. There is a reservoir of ink. Even a simple cartridge has a reservoir of ink, and it flows out of a pen. That's it, really. So a pen with a reservoir. If you want to see very creative use of a fountain pen's reservoir and it actually functioning as a fountain, then of course watch Indiana Jones. Third movie. The Last Crusade, the one with Sean Connery. And you'll see exactly what I mean. Beyond that, fun fact, in Dutch, we are much more pragmatic and less poetic, so we call it a vulpen, which means a filling pen, which I've always found a very appropriate name, given that it is a pen that you refill. But, you know, why not? Fountain pen, live on the edge, call it that. This was Consult the Doctor. I hope this was useful. I hope you found the content interesting and you've seen some of your questions answered. Please leave more questions below. I shall get to them as soon as I can. And that's all there's to it. I hope this was useful. And I'm glad to see you later. Bye-bye.